here we are, second edition of the aerial view of the fitness industry. And this week's guest is the CEO of Les Mills Asia Pacific, Ryan Hogan. G'day, Ryan.
Hey, Justin, how are you? And to everyone listening. Yeah.
I thought today would be great to get Ryan on. Being involved with Asia Pacific, he'll be able to give us an aerial view of the industry across multiple areas of Asia. We were just discussing before we went live about the US. It's not the space that he plays in. Most of the data that he would have there is probably more anecdotal. So rather than share anecdotal stuff, we're going to just focus on some clear stats that we've got out of Asia and some data. So what we thought we'd do is just get an overview or aerial view of the Asia Pacific region, and then we'll dive into what Les Mills, what Ryan is kind of thinking that the future of gyms might even look like. So we're in for a wild ride today. Ryan, first up, how is the Les Mills business doing, honestly, while all these gyms have been closed?
I mean, Justin, it's devastating. I mean, it's been devastating for most markets. About 2 to 2.5 months ago, when the gyms were asked to shut, basically, and it all happened, as we all know, in that period, in that very short period of a couple of weeks, starting in Asia, Europe, and then filtering down to the Southern Hemisphere. It's been devastating. I mean, completely and utterly devastating. A business that's been painstakingly built over 25 years basically came to a standstill. And when I say the business that came to a standstill, our economic engine being classes and clubs, classes, instructor-led classes and clubs, or virtual classes and clubs, has come to a complete standstill. And it's been as devastating as you could imagine. Also, our parent company, or not parent company, I should say, but where the content comes from, also have gyms, right, in New Zealand, and those gyms were shut. They were shut for 5 to 6 weeks. So you can imagine the global Les Mills business being Les Mills International around the programming and ownership of gyms. It all came to a complete standstill. So yeah, devastating. Devastating. That's probably the real answer.
It's probably the first time Philip has actually stopped in 25, 30 years running a business. He was forced to, but it gave him a chance to catch a breath, because he is the true entrepreneur that keeps inventing things and innovating. So it was probably a great opportunity for him to spend some time with Jackie. You also being part of APAC, Asia kind of got hit before Australia, didn't it? So you were probably seeing an impact to the Les Mills business prior to some areas, but then we kind of went up on the curve, and then it just kept going for you because it just went from country to country to country to country.
Country to country. I mean, so I should say we saw, and I'm not directly responsible for China, just to clarify. There is actually a CEO of China, Jane, very capable, who runs the whole Chinese business. But we were in regular dialogue with China when we saw what started happening after Chinese New Year, after that, the end of January and then through to February, which is sort of, I guess, 6 weeks, maybe a month or so before it hit the other markets. We watched Singapore pretty closely, Singapore and Hong Kong, because they had the first grumblings of cases outside of China. And then it appeared as though they were managing it really, really well. So they didn't have to shut. And then, of course, that changed down the track. But yeah, we did have, before Australia, we did have a little bit of insight into what was coming. But interestingly enough, the Southeast Asian markets, which I look after, and Australia all shut around the same time. It was literally a period of 2 weeks, I guess, where just one after the other, they shut. I live in Australia. I'm based in Sydney, so naturally had a bit of a focus towards the Australia side. And that was, as we all know, so quick, literally within the space of 12 hours, things had to shut down. But yeah, everything within the space of 2 weeks, everything. But yeah, we did have a little bit of insight as to what was happening out of China.
And now we're seeing clubs open in Australia. We've got Western Australia, we've got Northern Territory open. We've got a date for Queensland. We've got a date for Victoria. Some bizarre things in our country of Australia where some states are the opposite to other states, but you're also seeing some countries reopen in Southeast Asia. Can you give us an overview of from an aerial view, what's that looking like?
I can start with China, actually, because even though I'm not directly responsible for it, that's the one that we've got the best data for because they've been open for longest. So China basically shut after Chinese New Year, right? So the Chinese New Year, which is a period at the end of January, for anyone who's ever done any business in Asia, it's impossible to do any business. It's like our Christmas, right? That 2-week period. They shut and then didn't reopen, basically, after Chinese New Year. Clubs were shut for About 6 weeks in some areas, some places 8 weeks, depending on which prefecture, I think is the term they use there. Obviously, Wuhan was shut for a lot longer than Shanghai or Beijing. They opened basically as soon as they could. They opened with pretty low visitation, was the fact of the matter, but they also opened with a significant amount of government restrictions, which you would expect out of China, right? You expect, kind of what the Chinese government says to do is what you do.
That would be fairly common, wouldn't it? In a lot of Southeast Asian countries, there'd be a lot more compliance with the government frameworks than potentially having cowboys like we may have in Australia or in New Zealand.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you think of the spectrum of regulation, you probably have China at one extreme, and then you probably have America at the other extreme, of low regulation, and then Chinese high regulation. In Asia, it really depends on what market you're in. Vietnam is lots of state controls and lots of rules. Singapore, same thing. You get into Thailand and Indonesia and these sort of places, less so,
right.
Which unfortunately, though, just means they tend to take a blanket approach of we're just going to stay shut, right? What we're seeing in some of these countries in Asia is they won't open until they just think it's safe to just open as it was before, right? Whereas in some of the other countries with greater regulations, if they think they can build a framework around it, then they're more likely to open sooner. So good and bad from both sides. So yeah, China, the stats I was looking at and when I was preparing for this session was in the 7 weeks since opening, naturally we measure Group X more than anything else. Group X attendance is at about 85% of their new limits. So they're running at smaller class capacities. In most cases, I think the standard that people seem to be talking about is capping your classes at about 50 to 70% of what your 100% was before. And that depends on how many square meters your studio is and, your ability to practice physical distancing within the studio. I'll use an example of New Zealand. Who's ever been to the Les Mills gyms in New Zealand? The studios are huge, right? So naturally you can have more people in that studio and still have respecting physical distancing. Whereas the smaller studios, it's more difficult, right? So in Singapore, for example, all the gyms are pretty small. Same with Hong Kong, because there's not a lot of real estate available. So then their capacities are going to be significantly reduced because of their ability to manage the physical distancing, which depends, again, country to country.
So obviously we're talking about the capacity in the sense of how many people they can get in a studio, but we also talk about capacity in the number of classes. Yeah. Are you seeing that both the number of classes has dropped in order to drive more people into the classes, or they've kept the same number of classes and they're just running at 50 to 70% capacity?
They're actually running more classes, is what we're seeing in markets where group exercises, because we're going to talk about this in a sec, there's some markets where they've said no group exercise, right? Which is, again, how do you interpret that? That's up to the government and whoever's lobbying, right, on behalf of the industry. In some cases done much more successfully than others. In some markets, in China, for example, they're running more classes because they want to spread the visitation of people throughout the day, right? And also as people's rhythm of work changes, right? We're getting a lot of that in Australia that, because there's a lot of people don't want to take public transport. So people aren't doing 9 to 5s anymore. So if you're not doing a 9 to 5, well, then you can do a class at 10 o'clock in the morning, or you can do a class at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And also you might be more interested to do it because you're going to feel safer because there's less people. Yeah. So managing those former peak visitations, the 5:30 to 7:30 in the morning, and then the 5 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. is going to be that would come in my predictions is going to be a big issue. So we're seeing in the markets, the markets where group exercise is successful and is permitted to run, that they're actually running more classes. Virtual plays a part in that as well, right? In countries where labor is, expensive labor countries, the Nordic countries, Australia, New Zealand, where labor costs are quite significant, you're more likely to have a good virtual strategy. So you've got, your live classes at peak and then your virtual on the side. Whereas in the the less expensive labor markets, they'll just run more classes. Interesting though, in the less expensive labor markets, your instructors tend to be your employees anyway, right? As opposed to contractors, which is the norm here or anywhere else. So yeah, coming back to China, like I said, 6 weeks since opening, 6 to 7 weeks, Group X is now at 85% capacity of their new capacity, so not of their old capacity. That's a stat from one pretty successful club partner, but seems pretty consistent that once members get out there and they start seeing that it's safe and feeling safe, they pretty quickly start to come back again, right? But those first few weeks are a bit rocky. And then anecdotally as well around membership sales and PT, are also doing well. There's in China in particular this is in our space, but one-on-one personal training's had a little bit of a comeback after being a bit on the decline, for a while, and in favor of small group. And I think, and some of the issues there, which I think are pretty natural, is in the small group PT, you've got the issue of sharing equipment, right? And dumbbells and med balls and all that stuff, and sweating on it, even though sweat's not an issue, but, heavy breathing on the dumbbell and then sharing it with the guy in front of you. Whereas you don't have that in one-on-one PT, right? You can feel safe in a one-on-one personal training session. And equally, although perhaps it's counterintuitive, that's the word, in large scale group X, you also don't tend to share equipment, right? When you go and do a body pump class, that's your stuff and you use it for the whole class. And then as long as there's a decent set of cleaning after, then, the next person isn't going to share that either. So it's that middle ground, small group, I guess, training that's had a big explosion over the while. That's probably going to be a bit challenged, or that's what we're seeing in the market. So you get people are gravitating towards group X because you stand in one spot. You don't really move around too much, or you go into a cycle class where you're on one bike. And, the next bike is free at the moment, because they're, every other bike or whatever you're doing. And, you feel safe because this is your spot and you can control it. You can sweat all over it, but it's your sweat, right? Or you can breathe all over it, but it's your breathing.
Have you seen a spike in your data around, say, body pump where you're not moving compared to body attack where you're all over the place
where you're running in circles? Yeah, absolutely. 100%. And in fact, in China, again, China being China, the government has banned some of those classes, of saying, you can't, the classes where you come in and where you're close to each other are not permitted. So right. we only want to allow classes where you stand in one spot, or where everybody moves to the right at the same time and everybody moves to the left, which again, if you think about it, again, counterintuitive for some, traditional group X is like that, you stand in one spot and okay, now we're going to this will show my age. We're going to grapevine to the right, and we all grapevine to the right together, and we all grapevine to the left together, and certainly we're seeing that. And body pump in particular, anything mind body balance, yoga, where you're kind of lying in one spot, indoor cycle where you're just riding on one spot and you don't really move, or RPM, any of those, definitely more popular.
Have you seen a spike in those mind body classes because of the stress, I guess, that people are undergoing from their external environments? Are people turning towards the mind body to de-stress, or is that pretty much still the same?
It hasn't really changed much, actually. And interesting, when we look at, we'll get to Les Mills on Demand a little bit later in the conversation, we were expecting a big uplift in body balance and some of the other mind, but it hasn't really been the case, actually. For the people that have been the most popular programs on Les Mills on Demand, which I would suggest are probably the same in the gym, are the high intensity stuff, strength training, high intensity and grit, which is all the HIIT stuff. So we haven't seen that, actually. I think, yoga and all the mind body stuff was already on trend, before this, that, and will continue to do so. The yoga studios, I would hazard a guess, and I guess we'll come to that later, will probably do well out of this. They'll be able to open sooner, because they're able to manage restriction, physical distancing. You're standing on one spot. There isn't a whole lot of heavy breathing. There's a lot of reasons why I believe, anyway, the mind body studios will recover out of this quicker than others.
That's if they're not part of the definition of a gym.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. Or put in the same category as the pubs, right? Or the bars and the pubs, which I think has a lot of people concerned. So one just notable thing on China, and then we can move on, booking apps. I've said this on a number of interviews that I've had over the last while, controlling capacity is going to be about allowing people to book in. And in China, that was another one of the rules. You have to have booking apps, not just for your class, but for your access to the gym as well. And we've been really slow to do that as an industry around the world. There's some notable exceptions that do require people to book into to the classes, but we've been slow to do that. And that, to me, it seems just like a no-brainer to book in for your class, so you've guaranteed your spot. The boutiques have been doing it for years, right?
Is that one of your predictions in the future, that most clubs will have people like you'll just book in to do your 5:30 body pump class or whatever?
Yeah. I think we're going to see that. It won't happen in every market, right? Again, we talk about the spectrum of regulation. Is it likely to be mandated to do it in the US? No, I don't think so. I don't think it'll be. What's happening in Australia is the government isn't getting into that level of detail of regulation, right? They're leaving it to, because we have a peak body which not many markets do. I don't expect we'll see that here, but in the more regulated ones we will. But I think we'll see a big uptake in that, in the booking app sort of space. Yes, I do. I think it would be wise for clubs to look into it.
I mean, best business practices, if all of a sudden, which we've never had really, is we actually have data collected on the people that are going in and doing pump or doing balance, which you can get by having people book in, would in my mind, I'm going, that's got to strengthen your ability to internally market your products.
Of course, absolutely, right? And you just have so much more control over that space, right? I mean, I think if you think about group exercise in the heyday, right? The heyday would be arriving at a gym, really busy gym, heaving at the seams. There's 100 people outside the studio, all rubbing shoulders, waiting to run into the studio and pass. I mean, maybe that might come back at some point once we've got a vaccine, but that's a ways away, isn't it? What is it? There's a great, one of my favorite expressions is hope is not a strategy, right? And hoping for the day when we have a vaccine so we can get back to normal is, it just seems absurd to me. So, I'd be thinking about, and I know I've heard you say this in many interviews and at many events, we got to adapt to what's here now, and move quickly, move quickly. So, hey, if booking apps is going to make your members feel better about coming to the gym, or make your local government feel better about you opening, why wouldn't you do it?
Allow you to control your membership flow.
So Hong Kong was, again, one of the first countries to have cases outside of China, which you would imagine, given the relationship between the two. Managed it pretty well. They've had a very, very low infection and very low death rate, despite the fact that everyone in Hong Kong lives on top of each other. So that's an interesting observation. Anyone who's been to Hong Kong, everyone lives in an apartment that's about this big, and everyone congregates in areas that are about that big. And there's no physical distancing in Hong Kong, is basically an impossibility, right? So they've managed it pretty well. However, having said that, they did shut the clubs for about a month. Now, I don't have hard data on this, so it's very anecdotal, but what I've heard is since the clubs were opening, basically almost went back to pre-COVID visitation. So there was little change there. Big uptick in one-on-one PT, just like China saw. They don't have as stringent regulations around clubs in Hong Kong as they do in China, so they're just sort of letting it manage it. What's worth saying about Hong Kong is they've been through this kind of thing before. They've had SARS, they've had, other issues, street protesting, and, it's a difficult place to be, Hong Kong, right? So there's a general perception in the market that Hong Kong's like, hey, we got this, like we're the cultural thought around it is, it's okay. Oh, one other thing I should say, and this is common in China and Hong Kong, is masks. Masks are pretty much mandatory for staffing and for people, but you need a mask to go out onto the street, right? Not just, let alone to go to the gym. But also, if you think about culturally, in Asia, it's not unusual to see people wearing masks. No. They just do. Even in pre-COVID times, if you were in Shanghai or you were in Hong Kong, there would be people just wearing masks because A, for pollution, then they're quite concerned about, and B, once they get into flu season, they just all put masks on. That's culturally, that's just accepted. Whereas in the West, for us, it's a whole like, oh, mask, what's wrong with you? And in Asia, they don't have that. I mean, I wasn't in China. I haven't been in China for a while, but I was in Malaysia and Singapore late February, so just before the proverbial hit the fan, and there was not a whole lot of cases or anything happening in Malaysia or Singapore. Yet everyone was like, oh, this might be bad, it might not, and everyone was wearing masks. Walking through Singapore Changi, the airport, everyone was wearing masks. All the white guys, all the Westerners, we were the odd ones out, whereas the locals were all just almost staring at you like, what's wrong with you, right? But that's just it's a cultural thing. They're kind of used to. And then so. Just again,
your observations, are people wearing masks while they actually do a class?
Yeah, they had to. In China, they had to. They had to wear it. They had to wear it. I'm not sure if that's still the case now, 7 weeks later, but certainly at the beginning it was a requirement. Staff had to wear masks. Now, you got to keep in mind in China, I mean, again, spectrum of regulation, right? So there's an app that you have to leave your home, right? That says you don't have COVID-19. So when they had to check in at the gym, they had to show that, you have to show this to go into shopping centers and all kinds of stuff in China. Like, it's not unusual. So, and the mask. So every single piece of risk was being managed here, right? But yeah, masks were definitely compulsory, and they were compulsory whilst exercising, and for the instructors whilst teaching as well,
Okay.
along with the cleaning staff, the reception, the membership sales, everything. So that's China. And Hong Kong, that's probably all the data I have in Hong Kong, but again, it's a unique kind of, Hong Kong's a unique situation. I wouldn't expect that to be replicated in other places. They got it under control. They've seen this before. They're just kind of getting on with life, right? That's the Hong Kong way of mind. Yeah.
Another speed bump for them.
Yeah, literally.
What's the big winner? Like, out of all of those Southeast Asian countries, looking at your data, what country do you see has bounced back really good?
Well, the rest of Southeast Asia hasn't bounced back, right? When we get into that, but of the markets that I look after, the shining star is Vietnam, bizarrely, which you wouldn't necessarily off the top of your head think, but they have. I mean, the gyms were, so if I think about, well, the country, first of all, very, very low infection rate, very, very low death rate, despite bordering China, right? A significant amount of land border with China. They responded pretty quickly, shut the borders, no international travel, canceled all flights. They did all the draconian stuff that actually Australia, we just did it a few weeks later. They did the same thing, and they started shutting down fitness and other things by district, so by city, and then just went for a full blanket approach for a month. The gyms were shut for a month from the end of March, but they reopened the first week of May. So they were shut for a month at worst. Some districts a little bit longer, districts that had a high infection rate. Very, very limited community transmission. And a recurring theme, which we'll discuss later, is locally, it is perceived that the disease was managed well, right? It was perceived that the disease was managed well, so consumer confidence is high. And because consumer confidence is high, the gyms haven't reported a huge decrease. They also weren't shut for very long. And this is an interesting thing that I guess we'll see over time. The longer you're shut, the harder the bounce back is, right? The harder the bounce back is. So for Vietnam, about 10%, we saw 10% drop in visitation and club closures during that period, with it slowly recovering. There is a thought that the real data will come in a couple of months. They've only been open for a few weeks, 3-4 weeks. And, it's about how long is it going to take you to climb out of that, right? So, but, anecdotally, things are pretty good. Things are pretty good in Vietnam, and the borders are still shut. So there's that perception again of safety, right? That perception of things being managed well. But the rest of the markets that we operate across in Asia, Japan's still shut as of last week when I looked at it. I don't look after Japan, but as far as I know, Japan's still shut, despite having a pretty good initial reaction to the health crisis. They slid backwards, so things have been shut. Malaysia's still shut with no clear picture as to when that's going to open either. It's a large market for us, so it's difficult. Singapore, Singapore is an interesting one. At the end of last week, they announced everyone was expecting everything would open in June. And the end of last week, indoor sports centers and gyms July at the earliest, which is it was really, really a kick in the guts for the local industry, because there's a perception that there's not a whole lot of community transmission. That it's a certain area of society that's got the disease, but the government's taking a very risk adverse approach, and they're just saying no. We're going to be shut for a while. So, Singapore, which at the beginning of all of this was seen as a good example of how to do it. So, in other markets, Indonesia, very, very hard to tell. Very, very hard to tell, because what you hear officially versus what you hear on the street are two very different things. And then the Philippines, which is our other large market, again, very hard to know what's happening on the ground. So you sort of have Indonesia and the Philippines over here, and that who knows. And then you have Singapore that has a kind of clear, okay, this is what has to happen. Thailand, the gyms are allowed to open this week, but only for personal training, one-on-one personal training. So no group training, no group X, and no cardio machines. So again, bizarre restrictions, right? So we'll see, I guess. It's a work in progress, I'll tell you that, across the whole sector.
The thing that just amazes me, Ryan, is, again, you're at China at one end, or you're at the various states in the US and anywhere in between. Just, it seems no logic in reopening strategies that governments are saying. They're all different. they're all saying something completely different.
Yeah.
It kind of shows, I guess, historically, like we're now as an industry paying the price of being fragmented historically.
Yes.
That we're not united. So like everyone's in one country, they're not going, oh, I know what a gym is. This is how you'll now operate. Instead, we're all over the place. So then they're going, oh, you're all over the place. We're going to be all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. So again, so the Southeast Asian markets that we operate in, there's no peak bodies, right? There's no code of conduct. There's no best practice. There's no, which is not too dissimilar to the US, although I guess the US has URSA and a few other bodies that lobby on their behalf. And that's really challenging, that because who does the government go to? The government doesn't know what a gym is, right? Government can understand what a restaurant is, right? Because everyone goes and eats at a restaurant. Government can understand what a bar is, or perhaps a stadium, a nail salon, yeah, a nail salon, a hairdresser. Not that that's anyway relevant for me. Governments can understand that, but actually, government doesn't really understand what a gym is, right? So then, in some countries, well, who does the government go to? Who do they speak to, right? And I have to say, in Australia, we're very lucky. We have Fitness Australia. We have Fitness Australia, who, for better or for worse, is doing a really, really good job and working tirelessly. And then the government can go to Fitness Australia and say, all right, show me what best practice is, right? As opposed to going to a private operator who maybe has some vested interest in doing it. And again, we'll talk about New Zealand in a sec as far as statistics go. New Zealand has done a fantastic job of this. Credit to the guys at Exercise, or the team at Exercise New Zealand. They've done a wonderful job in creating an opening code of conduct, as has Fitness Australia. But New Zealand, I guess, has been successful with it, right? Because they've created this, they've lobbied, and they got the restrictions removed. Yeah.
Richard in New Zealand's been talking heavily with the government people, and that just makes such a difference when someone who understands our industry gets to talk to the people that make decisions, rather than the people that make decisions tell us what to do.
And also, I think worth saying, though, it's easier the smaller you are, right? And it gets exponentially harder the bigger you are, right? Again, if you talk on the spectrum of, New Zealand, an island at the bottom of the world with 4 million people, versus the US, which is like the center of the world with 300 million people, like different set of problems, right? Completely different set of problems. So you can have the Exercise Association of New Zealand can probably have direct dialogue with, if not the Prime Minister, whoever the person is that's making the decision on behalf of the Prime Minister. That's hard to do the bigger you are. I mean, that's even hard to do in Australia, which is 23 million people. So 5 times the size of New Zealand. But then you have in Australia, you've got the states, right? And the states operating different, the territories operating differently. So, but that does make a big difference. And in Asia, there isn't that. So then gyms, we just get put in the same category as a stadium or a large gathering at a pub, because that's where people gather, and people go to the gyms and they gather, and then they sweat, even though sweat has not been proven to have any sort of transmission of this disease, right? But the amount of times I've had to correct people saying, well, there's sweat everywhere. I'm like, well, yeah, but it's a respiratory disease. It's not, and you don't get it from people sweat. Now, yes, people breathe heavily in a gym, which is something that we need to think about, but it's a respiratory illness. It's not anyway. So, but again, you can imagine some government minister in a small country who's never stepped foot in a gym making these sort of decisions. It's difficult. That's why lobbying is important. Lobbying is where the role of the peak bodies come in. And if you haven't got a peak body, then you got to do it yourself, right? And you got to go and talk to your competitors and and I'm sure that it's happening, right? We see it happening in Asia, but getting that direct access is difficult when you're not, when you may have some vested interests.
I have a Rex member in the United States that we work with, and he donates a few $100, maybe $1,000 a year to the red team.
Yep.
And his wife donates the same amount to the blue team. So in the local county that they live, the mayor or the opposition mayor knows exactly who these people are because they've been donating for years. So guess who that was the first person that the mayor called when they were talking about reopening gyms?
Of course, yeah.
So this guy's, while he's written off $1,000 or $2,000 a year, not a lot of money over the course of a year, over 10 or 15 years, he's pretty much saved his business now. It's like an insurance policy that he and his wife were paying over the last 10, 15 years. I found that particularly interesting. But of course, if you've got a strong body like Exercise New Zealand, what data actually have you got out of New Zealand?
Yeah, so New Zealand, I think this will be particularly interesting for anyone who's listening to this in Australia, because I think we can probably compare the two. You know, they're good comparisons. Similar, similar shut. Sorry, I'm gonna adjust the light here. Similar shutdowns, although New Zealand went into full 5 weeks of not being able to leave your home unless you're going to the supermarket. But similar, also market perception on management of the disease, right? You know, relatively low case numbers, very low death rate, all that sort of stuff. So New Zealand, the gyms have been open for just over a week. So still very, very early days. And of course, I don't have, industry-wide data here. This is just anecdotal conversational stuff. So don't quote me on this, but looking at it, 2/3 of pre-COVID visitation, 2/3 of pre-COVID visitation at the clubs. Group X seems to be performing well, but again, that's probably an indication of the New Zealand market. Group exercise is a big deal in New Zealand, especially in the Les Mills gyms in New Zealand. It's a big part of what they do. It's worth noting as well, though, highlighted it briefly before, that Exercise New Zealand, the Exercise Association of New Zealand, with support from Les Mills over there, from the Les Mills gyms, were successful, very successful in lobbying government to remove some of the crippling regulations, right? So it was originally said that the gyms could open with 100 people per facility, right? And that was successfully amended to 100 people per room, assuming you can have adequate physical distancing, right? The physical distancing. So that's not just, okay, you can put 100 people in your room. No. Like if your room can, they have to have the 2 square meter rule. You can, if you've got a huge facility, then you can have up to 100. But that doesn't mean, again, very clarifying, that doesn't mean 100 people in every room. But they were successful in that. And that allows large centers to open, right? Because, if you can do physical distancing, then open. And I think that's a position that personally we'd like to see in Australia. Like let's stop thinking about these numbers, 20 people per location, which we'll get to Australia in a sec, per location or per venue or per room. And let's talk about physical distancing, right? Because if you're a large facility, then arguably you can manage physical distancing better than anyone, right? Because you've got all the room. So that's why New Zealand. So yeah, pretty, 2/3 of pre-COVID attendance. I don't have cancellation data, but I understand it's not been a bad week of cancellations, because I think everyone's worried about that, right? When you do that first DD run, when you open the clubs again, how many of your members are going to ring you to cancel? They have had some cancellations and more than normal, but nothing to write home about as of yet. But I guess we'll have to see how that goes on time. And at the moment in New Zealand anyway, a lot of attendance at suburban locations is much greater than in the CBD locations, which again is probably just a reflection of people are still working from home. So you'd have to think that as working from home thing continues, the suburban clubs or gyms are going to benefit from that, right? Where the urban ones are going to struggle until we can get dense groups of people together again, which is in the case in a lot of CBD locations. So that's the anecdotal data. I think, in another couple of weeks, we should get, after a month in operations, we should get some good data out of New Zealand that we can share. And I'm sure the global business will be willing to share it, because it's also about sending a message of hope, right? That there is a life after COVID. So, but yeah, Group X, Group X is popular. I should say as well, this framework that Exercise New Zealand prepared goes actually above and beyond what the government had required. And I think that's a very smart strategy. If the government gives you, or your local council or whatever market you're operating gives you this, do this, right? Do this, because you're less likely to get, to have issues. And also that can also help you around these crippling number regulations that are out there, right? Because that's our challenge. And when we get to Australia, that's going to be the challenge here, is these numbers, these arbitrary numbers that people have come up to are going to really hurt our industry long term.
It's interesting. We have in the active management community, there's a great feed going on at the moment where I pose 3 questions to clubs that were already open. And Adrian Antigua from Gainesville, he said for the clubs that are already open, the thing that surprised them the most was how many members came in and wanted to hug the group fitness instructors.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And because, that's kind of the culture of what we have as group fitness instructors. And so all of a sudden it's like
elbow knocking. Yeah.
But he said for that first week, it was incredibly weird, because the members just innately want to do that hug. And so did our staff, but we had to train our staff to go, well, no, I can't. I want to, but I can't.
Yeah, because I've got to do this with 100 other people a day.
It never, ever occurred to me that would even be an issue in a club. But the group fitness people, they love the hugs.
Wow. Well, extraordinary, isn't it? Extraordinary.
Okay, let's do a quick wrap on Australia, and then let's think about some of the things that might look like moving forward in the group fitness space.
So Australia is work in progress, I think. It's probably the best way to describe it. For the listeners that aren't here, even though everything got shut down in exactly the same way across the whole country, things are opening on a state-by-state basis. Some states are introducing restrictions that are frankly going to cripple the majority of the commercial fitness operators, and also just some absurd contradictions and, things like, let's start with WA, right? So Western Australia, very isolated, has managed the disease exceptionally well, very, very low cases. And also West Australians have very much an attitude of, let's just get on with it. That's sort of it's a thing in WA. They've decided that through the regulations, so on opening, the gym floor is not allowed to open, but Group X is allowed to open, which again, interesting, right? And that to me strikes us, benefits us, of course, but strikes me as some politician says, well, on the gym floor, there's sharing of equipment, so we should just not let that happen, right? But again, they've capped it at 20 people per room. So if you have a couple of studios, that's okay. You can run that. But interestingly, no indoor cycling, because apparently that's very risky. So again, someone's made that decision, and that'll probably change over time. There's also a big push in Western Australia to allow things to happen outdoors. So there's a lot of outdoor classes and stuff happening because there's less restrictions on that than there are indoors. So, and if all goes well, I believe that's due to be lifted from 20 to 100 within the next kind of month or so. So that's taking us probably till the mid to late June. Northern Territory's open basically with no restrictions. Some level of restriction around amount of people, but no, like they didn't say no gym floor, none of that. Again, in the Northern Territories, a perception that the disease has been managed very, very well, very low case numbers, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have Queensland, who who knows what
the place is a country within our country.
Yeah, country within a country, shut borders. Yet, from what I understand, and this was up until over the weekend, gyms can open, but only with 20 people in the whole gym. So, for some boutiques, that'll be fine. And for the yoga studios, that'll be fine. For the majority of commercial fitness centers, that's not going to work, right?
That's from the 12th of June.
Yes, correct. Yeah, in a couple of weeks. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's not right now. That's in a couple of weeks. I understand behind the scenes, there's a significant amount of lobbying happening at the moment to relax that, or to modify it to 20 per room, as they've done in Western Australia and some of the other states. And then, Victoria, 22nd of June, from what I understand, 20 people per room, which was unexpected. We weren't expecting to get that from Victoria, but that's what's come. So, but again, 22nd of June, that's still a month away. So still some time. And then New South Wales, where you and I live, who knows? Who knows? However, for the 1st of June, you can have 50 people in the pub. So, which was announced on Friday, which is quite interesting. There's, I believe, amongst my team, and so there's a bit of a hope that, hey, if you can have 50 people in the pub, surely you can have 50 people in the gym, right? So fingers crossed that New South Wales, and I should say one more, ACT, so the Australian Capital Territory, from this coming weekend, gyms can open. So the last weekend in May, gyms can open. Maximum, it seems at this point, maximum of 20 in the whole gym, right, as opposed to per room. However, ACT government hasn't published the guidelines just yet. That's coming over the coming days. That also caught us by surprise because we felt that ACT would follow New South Wales because of their shared borders. But nope, they've just decided to, because in Canberra, which is, the only city in the ACT, there's very low level, like 0 cases has been for weeks. So they're just deciding we need to move things along. People are going to get annoyed with me if I don't mention Tasmania and South Australia. Tassie, I'm actually not sure around the regulations there. I know they've announced a roadmap, but I'm not sure what it is. And South Australia from the 8th of June can open, but it's unclear whether it's 20 per gym or 20 per room. And that's due to be clarified this week. Obviously, the 20 per room can be managed a lot better than the 20 per facility, right? So yeah, it's still work in progress, right? And I hope to hear from the Premier of New South Wales this week. I think we'll hear from the Premier of New South Wales this week, or someone from within the New South Wales government that will speak to when we can move in New South Wales, particularly given Victoria's now given a date and Queensland's given a date, albeit with restrictions. You'd expect to hear something from New South Wales very soon.
So, mate, that's a great overview of Australia, New Zealand, Southeast Asia. thank you. I think people find it particularly fascinating. You touched on a few things there, and I know I don't want to take from your presentation that you're delivering. Is it this week or next week?
Friday. Yeah, Friday this week.
This Friday for a conference coming out of Singapore called
X-Pro.
X-Pro. So I don't want to take from that because we want people to go to that. But let's just peer into the crystal ball for a moment. What are the three top things that you think will change in our industry moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm gonna quote our good friend or colleague Emma Barry, who spoke at FILEX a few weeks ago, and she used this term. This is the seminal moment for digital in the fitness industry, right? As an industry, we've been pretty slow. We've been a bricks and mortar focused kind of situation, and compared to relative to the rest of society, we've been pretty slow. And these last however long you're going to be closed, which again in different markets is different for everyone. It's proven that there's an appetite to exercise at home, right? And it's forced people to do so, or at home or wherever you're able to do so. So this is our moment for digital. So, and this, if we don't change to embrace digital as an industry, or bring the digital experience into our clubs and also allowing our members to have a digital experience at home, then we've just wasted the last 6-8 weeks, right? This is the time of it. So Les Mills, we've had Les Mills on Demand on the market for a while now. It went from a product that nobody wanted to a product that everybody wanted within the space of, when I say nobody, I mean like in the commercial fitness industry, nobody wanted, to a product that everybody wanted over the last couple of months. Yeah, everybody wanted. In fact, a lot of people were not happy about Les Mills on Demand, and all of a sudden very happy about it, which is just the nature of our business, I guess. That ability for people to take the gym experience and take it outside of the four walls of the gym has got to be a permanent part of strategy moving forward. You've been saying that for 10 years at FILEX and URSA and the various conferences that you've been speaking at, as has everybody else. And there's been some good examples of people doing a good job of it. But I think now has been the time that people have had to morph on it. I mean, if I think outside the Les Mills sphere of influence, there's a studio up the road here in Paddington in New South Wales. And this guy has basically, I hate this term, but he's pivoted his whole business onto digital, right? But also maintained the in-person contact, right? Now that will be part of their strategy moving forward. And they've done a great job. They've taken, okay, we can't operate physical, so let's operate digitally. And now you start to see the communication coming out, which is, okay, now that we're thinking about coming back to physical, let's keep the digital going at the same time, right? So if you don't feel like you can come into the gym, or you're time poor, or you're stuck at work, you can still experience, you can still have a Les Mills experience, or a, whatever gym experience, right? So I think that, Chris, number one, I mean, this is the time for digital, and the operators that get it right will win, and the operators that don't will fail. I really do think, and consumers as well are now getting used to it, right? They're getting used to it because they've been forced to, right? Maybe they've invested in equipment. I know there's all kind of, maybe what was it? Kettlebells are the new toilet paper, right? It's
yeah, we can't get them anywhere.
Can't get them anywhere, right? I mean, it was funny, even in New Zealand where the gyms have opened, one of our team who's over in Auckland posted a photo from the local sports store on the weekend, and he just showed the rack of dumbbells that was empty. So even where the market's open, people are investing. So I think, now that people have invested and maybe even set up a little gym at home, our surveys say people still want to go back to the gym. They miss the community around it. To your point about members hugging the instructor, they miss the instructor, they miss the, and actually doing a group X class at home is not really doing a group X class, is it? It's doing a workout. Yeah. And they miss that vibe of the community and the motivation from the instructor. But, I think habits will change a little bit, and they will sometimes want to stay home, or if they get stuck in traffic or whatever, and they can still have that experience at a time and a place that's convenient for them. I mean, great. And then, hey, by the way, if your facility is also restricted on the amount of people you can have in it, wouldn't you want a digital strategy? Wouldn't you want, so you don't have to turn people away? Oh, I know you can't make it for the 5 p.m. class that's booked out, but actually that's the peak class. You can also do that from home, and we'll stream it to you. So anyway, that would be prediction number one, I guess. Prediction number two, it very relevant to the group exercise and the Les Mills thing. I see classes getting shorter.
Shorter time frame.
Yeah, I mean, we already have, like, all of our classes have, so have 60-minute 45-minute and 30-minute formats. I think the days of the 60-minute class are limited, at least for during this COVID period. And the reason for that is you want the time to clean, right? You need to be perceived to be cleaning actively. You need to be doing more cleaning than you ever. I've heard you say this a number of times. Sterile, sparse, disinfectant everywhere. The cleaning companies are going to do well out of this. So having that 10 to 15-minute break in between classes gives you that ability to do that. It also gives you the ability to stop having 100 people congregating outside of the studio waiting to come in, right? Because you don't want to do that. I mean, I don't know what it's been like for you. Have you been anywhere lately and you go into the supermarket and there's too many people and you turn around and you leave? Right? And that's just our psychology right now.
You actually don't think about it. You just go, oh, it's too many people, and you turn around and walk out.
Yeah.
It's kind of a new habit.
It's a new habit, right? And even though I guess a health professional might say otherwise, but it appears as though the risk in this country anyway of us going to the supermarket and contracting the disease is minor, very, very minor. Our psychology has shifted a little bit, right? Our psychology has shifted, and I don't imagine that's going to be any different at the gym, right? If you arrive at the gym and there's 50 people in close confines waiting to go into the class, there's going to be some people that are going to turn around and they're going to leave, right? So having that gap so you can clean, so you can get, traffic flow out and traffic flow in is going to be really critical. So, and that's been something that the clubs in New Zealand the Les Mills gyms in New Zealand have done, is they've shifted most of the 60-minute classes to 45-minute classes with 15-minute gaps in between. Part of that is also, if you've ever been to the gyms there, some of them are a bit like rabbit warrens. So the actual, where you wait for the class is a tiny little hallway, and you don't want people waiting in that space next to each other for 15 minutes. You want them waiting for a minute or two at most.
That stairwell up to their main studio in Auckland.
Yeah, it's like that, right? Yeah. So again, 15 minutes in between classes in Studio One allows the 5 minutes of people to leave, and then another 5 minutes for people to get in, and then an army of people in there kind of cleaning, and especially after body pump, wiping down the bars, and then there's a responsibility on the members as well, right? It's not just up to the staff to clean; it's also being put on the members. But I'd be thinking, if I was building a timetable for reopening, I'd be thinking 45 minutes with gaps. You just have to be perceived to be doing a good job.
Number 3.
I mean, I've sort of said it already, and this sits outside of the Les Mills line, but I think one-on-one PT is going to make a comeback. It's going to, not that it had disappeared, but I think it's going to make a bit of a comeback, because health and fitness is going to be an important part of the recovery of this, right? This is where I think our industry will do well, versus say the nightclub industry, or the dance parties, or all festivals. Like, you wouldn't want to be in that space. And one-on-one PT has the ability to do that. It also is a very controlled environment, right? And the trainer can do a very good job of keeping his or her client feel safe. And I think that there's a certain part of society that's going to want that. I mean, and in any country where outdoors is an option, one-on-one PT outdoors is a great option right now. It's a fabulous option. But I think one-on-one PT is going to make a comeback. It'll probably be a bit more affordable than it used to be as well. As the markets go into recessions, in some markets, deep recessions, it'll have to be a bit more affordable. I think it'll make a comeback. And yeah, they're probably the top 3, right? I mean, there's other things. I think in group exercise, virtual has got to be part of your strategy. The ability to run more classes in a cost-effective way, so you can spread the visitation of your members over the course of the week or the day is important, right? If you have a room that can fit 100 people and all of a sudden you can only put 50 in because of physical distancing, you need more classes. And if you're in an expensive labor market, virtual is a way to do that. Virtual is a way to do that. So virtual will tip, right? It's been growing for the last few years. I think it will tip, especially in the more developed markets.
Fascinating discussion, and I think we're really lucky to have you on the show today to share such a broad spectrum of ideas based on the varying countries that you oversee. So I'm really grateful for your time and for your insights. I love what you see in the crystal ball. I love the idea of PT. You also mentioned potentially booking apps for clubs, virtual. There's so many things that are going to be available to us that as an industry, as we come through the dark tunnel, the light at the other end is pretty darn bright for us if we get our shit together.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, this is a health crisis and an economic crisis, right? We have 2 things going on here. Who better than preventative medicine to help the health crisis, which is what we are, right? So if we can manage the perception of risk, and if we can manage the risk within our facilities, we should benefit from this, right? In the medium to long term. Right now, difficult. Right now, let me acknowledge it. the middle, the end of May 2020, right, for the next couple of months, it's going to be really tricky. And then on the economic side of things as well, though, I don't know, for anyone who was around in the gym business after 2008, we actually benefited from it, the mainstream fitness industry, because, for whatever you pay for your gym membership a week, which varies very much from country to country, it's still a hell of a lot cheaper than going to the cinema, or still a hell of a lot cheaper than going to an expensive restaurant. And you can go every day, and you can be entertained, and you might have a pool, and you might have, great instructors, and you might have good equipment and people. So we benefited from, we grew after 2000, because people didn't get rid of their gym memberships. I do, hand on my heart, think it's the same here. Now, the challenge is, and this inherent tension between the health and the economic crisis is not in most markets, we haven't quite overcome the health crisis yet. And while there's the health crisis going, no matter how you think of it, it's going to suck. It's going to be hard, right? But as we move into focusing really more on the economic crisis, which we're already kind of doing, once we're able to open with, a regulatory framework that is not crippling to business, we should over time benefit from this. We will. I believe that. And if I didn't believe that, if you didn't believe that, well, I'd be packing shelves at Woolies, like.
We're going to jump ship with another industry.
That's a very Australian expression, packing shelves at Woolies. I'd be doing something else. I do believe we'll come out of this. It's just, as I said before we signed up, it's really hard right now. Hand on my heart. This has been devastating for us, devastating for our industry, and it's going to take some time to get out of this. But we will. I said this at Phylux a few weeks ago. We'll survive this. We'll survive this, and we'll come out. We will thrive. At the other end of this, and we have an opportunity to really change the perception of what it is that we do. I think Barry from Fitness Australia said this really well. We have an opportunity to really get aligned with allied health and to get into that preventative health circle, which we've been, again, just like digital, we've been talking about that in the 20 odd years I've been in the fitness industry. We've been talking about getting aligned into the health space as opposed to just the exercise space. And I think that, this is an opportunity to do that. It's really tough at the moment, but there's energy and there is light. There is light at the end of the tunnel. I think we just got to get there.
Thank you, sir. I'm very grateful for your time. And I will, if anybody wants to contact you, what's the best way to contact you?
lesmills.com.au, or you can find me on LinkedIn. Don't really use the other socials. So LinkedIn, lesmills.com.au is where it's at.
Thanks, mate. You're awesome.
Thank you, Justin. Take care.